Good day, everyone. It's my big pleasure introducing our today's speaker, Marcelo Pereyra. Marcelo Pereyra is an associate professor in statistics at the School of Mathematics and Computer Science of Heriot-Watt University and the Maxwell Institute of Mathematical Sciences. His research focuses on new mathematical theory, methods, and algorithms to solve challenging inverse problems related to mathematical and computational imaging. And in particular, is interested in new Bayesian analysis and computational approaches for imaging, and in the synergy between the statistical and the variational the machine learning paradigms for developing imaging methodology. Marcelo has received several awards and distinctions during his career, among which I will only recall in particular a Marie Curie Intra-European Fellowship for Career Development in 2013, a Brunel Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Statistics in 2012, and two R&D Excellent Awards received from the Associations of Engineers of INSA in Toulouse and the Buenos Aires Institute of Technology. So today, Marcelo, we talk about Bayesian imaging using plug-and-play priors, and I leave you the stage and look forward for your talk.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, all of you for being online and taking some of your time to let me share this work with you, and thank you to the organizers, of course, for giving me the opportunity to present my work. So this talk is about a piece of work that was particularly challenging for me. It took us 3 years to complete, including 2 years of very intensive hard work with a team of 6 people in total. And the goal of this piece of work was to provide a foundation for plug-and-play methodology, but from the Bayesian perspective. So I'll explain in a minute what plug-and-play methods are and why we need to develop foundational work for them. So this is joint work with Rémi Lomont, Valentin de Bortoli, Julie Delon, Andrés Almanza, et Alain Dormuth, who are so they are all in Paris except for Valentin, who's currently at Oxford. Okay, so the structure of my talk is fairly straightforward. I'll introduce what plug-and-play methods are and why they are at the interface. I'll explain in particular why they are at the interface of different mathematical frameworks for developing imaging methodology. And then I'll present our work. So I'll separate that in 2 parts, a part related to modeling and a part related to computation. And I'll present some illustrations, numerical illustrations of our work, and then I'll conclude the talk. So if you have any questions, just send them through the chat or use the Q&A tool. Don't wait until the end. I would much rather take questions as they arise. And also, this is the first time that I'm presenting this piece of work, which we only submitted to arXiv a few days ago. So the talk is still a bit rough. I'm sure that I'll find small things that need to be corrected. So I apologize in advance for the fact that this talk is not as polished as I would like. So, okay, so we're in a scenario in imaging sciences where we have some forward model that describes how a true scene that we would like to acquire is actually observed. So if you're not familiar with this, well, you can just imagine a camera or any imaging device. Of course, it's subject to the laws of physics. It will have a limited resolution. It will have some noise. It will have some imperfections. And as a result, whenever you acquire an image, it will not be exactly equal to what you would consider to be the ground truth physical quantity that you're measuring. And this can be mathematically described by using laws of physics and different modeling strategies. The inverse problem is the problem of restoring or estimating the true scene from the observation when the mathematical models that we have tell us how the true scene became the observation, but they don't make it so easy to work out what was the true scene from this observed data. So mathematically, now I will be interested in estimating some large quantity X, which is an unknown image. For the purpose of this talk, it takes values in an Euclidean space of size D, a large space. And we don't measure X, what we measure, I'll call it Y. And it is related to X by some mathematical model. And for example, it could be a simple linear Gaussian observation model of the form y equals ax plus some noise w, or it could be something different. And so for the purpose of my talk, it could be, something more complicated or something as simple as this. What will, however, be a theme of my talk is that the recovery of x from y is not well posed. So typically, we don't have a situation where y on its own has enough information to reliably estimate x. The problem has high intrinsic uncertainty. This could manifest, for instance, if the operator A is poorly conditioned or rank deficient. And so additional information is required to regularize the problem and make it well posed and deliver meaningful solutions. So there's several different mathematical strategies that you could use to make the problem well posed. Here I'm describing three that I consider to be the three main mathematical frameworks, at least the frameworks I interact with most regularly. So the first one is the applied analysis framework. So many of you are applied mathematicians by training, and the kind of work that you do is what I will describe as applied analysis. The other approach is the Bayesian statistical approach, and that's mainly how statisticians address the problem. And then there's also the machine learning approach that is perhaps a bit more recent or has become a main approach more recently. And so I'll describe that as well in a minute. And these three frameworks have complementary strengths and weaknesses, and as well as many other people, we have been thinking of ways of unifying them so that we can produce a unifying set of theory, methods, and algorithms that inherits the benefits of each approach. So this piece of work is one specific contribution in this area. There are, of course, many other people working on this, including in my own research group. So, okay, the applied analytical or variational approach constructs solutions by using variational inequalities, so usually a differential equation, a PDE, or an equivalent optimization formulation. And it will typically study estimators of this form. We have some potential or energy function composed of two terms, a data fidelity term, a regularization term, and we'll seek to minimize the sum of those two. There are some variants. We could minimize one subject to a constraint on the other one. And in this community, there is significant attention to the construction of very efficient and provably converging iterative algorithms to solve that kind of optimization problem, or to solve to compute a fixed point of the variational inequality. And broadly speaking, some advantages and disadvantages could be, well, the methods in this class are conceptually very tractable, they're modular, they're easily adapted to reflect changes in the problem. If we change the settings of the imaging instrument, it's very easy to change the data fidelity term to reflect those changes. If the nature of the scene has changed, we could change the regularizer. Importantly, solutions are often well posed in infinite dimensions, and that problem, that minimization problem in an Euclidean space, arises from discretizing that infinite dimensional estimator to finite dimensions. And because things are well posed in infinite dimensions, they naturally scale well to large problems. In particular, when f plus g is convex, we understand these methods really well because a lot of smart people have been working on this for a long time. And now people are focusing mainly on non-convex formulations. This is something that is more difficult, but there has been a lot of progress in this area. On the other hand, this kind of approach will struggle with models that are partially unknown. So for instance, a simple example is if there is a regularization parameter that is unknown, it could be just a scalar, but really make the problem a lot more difficult. If some elements of the operator A are known, again, it makes the problem more difficult. It is not really well equipped to deliver advanced inferences or uncertainty quantification or things like model selection in the absence of ground truth. If I have some observed data Y and I have two potentials to minimize, it's not so easy to know which one I should use, in the sense that the mathematical framework that has produced the potentials does not give clear tools to assess whether they are suitable or not for a specific data set. And then when we move to non-convex settings, the kind of guarantees that we get are often significantly weaker. It's not the same thing guaranteeing that we converge to the minimizer of potential than to guarantee that we converge to the fixed point of an arbitrary variational inequality. So that's a disadvantage. The Bayesian framework is a probabilistic approach. So we adopt subjective probability and represent the unknown image X as a random quantity and use probability distributions to model the properties of the solution and the relationship between the solution and the observed data Y. So here we specify, or we regularize the problem by specifying the marginal density of X. It's what in the Bayesian statistics literature people call the prior, and it represents prior knowledge available. And inferences about X from Y are then derived by constructing a joint statistical model combining X and Y. We typically specify this joint model by specifying the condition of Y given X, called the likelihood, which represents the physics of the observation system, including stochastic aspects of the system, and times the marginal distribution of X, so the prior. This defines a joint distribution, and from that, using Bayes' theorem, we can derive the posterior distribution, which is essentially the conditional density of the unknown image X given the observed data Y. And this models our beliefs about X after observing Y. And now this has some significant advantages, but also some disadvantages compared to the applied analytical approach. I'll discuss this in a minute. First, I want to emphasize that unlike other frameworks where we postulate an estimator and then study the estimator, in the Bayesian framework, we typically postulate a model, but then derive estimators by using Bayesian decision theory. So in particular, what we do is we specify a loss function L, and the Bayes estimate with respect to this loss is the point in space that best summarizes all possible solutions given by X given the observed data. With respect to that way of measuring statistical estimation error. So it minimizes the expectation of the estimation error. When we use the mean square error as estimation error measure, what we obtain is the posterior mean as estimator of X, and this is called the minimum mean square error estimator. Alternatively, in the imaging literature, we often see the maximum a posteriori estimator obtained by maximizing the density or minimizing the potential, so minus the log density. And when we have convexity, this is also a well understood Bayesian estimator. It comes from a Bregman type loss. Advantages and disadvantages, well, we still have conceptual tractability, modularity, and it's easy to change a Bayesian model to reflect changes in the problem. We understand really well the foundation and the computational aspects of performing Bayesian inference in imaging problems. When we have a convex geometry, we're making progress in non-convex settings, but it is more difficult. We have a beautiful mathematical decision theory to handle advanced inferences, uncertainty quantification, and partially unknown models. There's a lot of interesting work on how to estimate unknown model parameters, how to perform model selection. And there's a lot of interesting ideas that have not reached the imaging community yet because they're not easy to apply in problems that are that big, but foundationally, everything is there. Solutions are not usually well posed in infinite dimensions, although there are Bayesian models that are well posed in infinite dimensions. Most of the models used at the moment are not. So when we deal with a high dimensional problem, we often have issues. The algorithms have a performance that deteriorates as we increase the dimension of the problem. We have been working on making Bayesian algorithms more scalable, and there are some very fast Bayesian computation algorithms, particularly for problems that have an underlying convex geometry. So this is an area where there's a lot of progress, but the truth is that performing Bayesian computation is still a lot more expensive than solving a variational inequality for models of similar complexity, particularly in the case where we have convexity. Accurately modeling the marginal distribution of X, so the prior, is difficult, and this has implications. In particular, when I compute Bayesian probabilities, if I want to know if something about that model from a frequentist perspective. So a different definition of probability, the probability in the sense of what happens if I repeat this experiment many times. Well, Bayesian probabilities will not coincide with frequentist probabilities unless the model is really good. And in imaging, models are often too simple. So Bayesian probabilities are not reliable from a frequentist point of view. How do we perform Bayesian computation in imaging problems? Well, there's a range of methods that you could use, and there's survey papers on the topic. Here, I'll just discuss two methods that are relevant for this talk. So one of them is the unadjusted Langevin algorithm, and the other one is stochastic gradient descent. They both look structurally very similar. What we do is we construct a Markov chain where we're standing at a certain point in space, and then we take a gradient, a step along the gradient of the log posterior density, and we add a Gaussian perturbation. The nature of the Gaussian perturbation is a bit different. It has different variance in ULA and in stochastic gradient descent. And as a result, these two algorithms will deliver solutions that are very different in nature. ULA will generate a Markov chain that generates samples that are almost distributed according to your target distribution, the posterior distribution. And you can use them to perform Monte Carlo integration, for instance, to compute the posterior mean, so the mean square error estimate. Stochastic gradient descent will not produce samples from this distribution. Instead, it will find the maximum or a maximum of your distribution. And so it's an optimization algorithm. And they are both derived from the Langevin stochastic differential equation. And following years of very good work by some very smart people, we now understand these algorithms remarkably well. We have a very detailed understanding of when they converge, how quickly they converge, non-asymptotic guarantees, and all under easily verifiable conditions. So these are not the fastest algorithms around, but there are some algorithms we understand really well. So they are a good starting point for developing plug-and-play algorithms if we want to understand those algorithms really well. OK, machine learning takes a different approach. So let's suppose that we have training data, a lot of training data, for instance, a database of clean images, and also the associated degraded observations, X and Y. And I want to use this training data to learn how to estimate X from Y. Most methods, what they do is they find an estimator that empirically minimizes the estimation mean square error. So what they're essentially doing is learning a Bayesian estimator. So the posterior mean of X given Y for the distribution that has generated this training data set. These estimators are often represented by using end-to-end deep neural networks. When there's enough training data and training goes well, they deliver excellent solutions. However, it's not so easy to change a network to reflect changes in the problem. So if I'm using some imaging device and it has some knobs, and I change the knobs to change, for instance, the focal length or some other aspects of the imaging problem, or the illumination conditions have changed, it's not so easy to explicitly take that into account in my network. What I could do is train the network with a variety of scenarios. And when the variety is not too big, the network still performs well. But when there are significant changes in the structure of the problem, then I need to retrain the network. So this is a disadvantage by comparison with the other methods. OK, so plug-and-play approaches are a very clever idea that allows you to combine a data-driven regularizer with an explicit data fidelity or likelihood term. So the idea, it comes from the observation that in many algorithms that we use, the term representing the prior or the regularizer is a denoiser. So it can be seen as a denoising algorithm. And the idea is, well, let's replace this denoising algorithm by a much better denoising algorithm, say, for instance, a state-of-the-art neural network, and plug it into the algorithm, instead of the denoiser that would come from taking the gradient or the proximal operator of your denoiser, and let's see what happens. And it turns out that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it works remarkably well, and it outperforms everything else in the literature. So that has stimulated a lot of research in the area, and now many of the state-of-the-art image reconstruction models are, methods are based on this idea. And for example, if we did that in our case, we could construct a plug-and-play ULA or a plug-and-play stochastic gradient descent by replacing the log gradient of the prior by this term that I have highlighted in red, so x minus the denoiser. And this is a generic denoiser. It could be a neural network that I have trained to denoise really well the kind of images I'm looking for when they are contaminated with, say, Gaussian noise with variance epsilon. Now, these kind of schemes, we have not proposed them. So these are schemes that people had already identified and that were working really well. What we thought would be good was to contribute to improving our understanding of this kind of tool. So we're not the only ones working in this area. There's a lot of people actively working on this. So in particular, a lot of people have adopted a variational perspective, and they're either explicitly working in a variational setting, so trying to understand, say, what energy function we're minimizing or what variational inequality we're solving, or they have adopted superficially a Bayesian formulation in that they will refer to their model as a Bayesian model and talk about a prior, but then they will compute a maximum a posteriori estimator and very quickly revert to a variational formulation where they have an optimization problem. And then the main areas of attention have been improving our understanding of these methods to try to explain a bit better what they are, what they're computing, why sometimes they work, why sometimes maybe they won't work, demonstrate their performance, and then develop better methods, and in particular develop methods with provably, that are provably convergent. So methods that we know will converge to something. To what they converge, that is a more difficult question. In most cases, these denoisers do not define a maximally monotone operator, so not a gradient, not a prox. We don't necessarily have an energy function. So it's not so easy to say what they're converging to, but first of all, it's good to know that that they converge. So our aim here is to formalize the Bayesian perspective on this and answer a number of important questions that we think partially provide a foundation for developing more advanced Bayesian plug-and-play methods. So first of all, under what conditions on the denoiser should we expect a Bayesian plug-and-play model to be well-defined, well-posed in the sense of Hadamard, amenable to efficient computation? When will estimators exist? If I'm computing the posterior mean from a Monte Carlo chain, do I know that the posterior mean exists? Do I know that that Monte Carlo chain has the capacity to deliver estimators of the posterior mean? There's a number of basic things that need to happen for that estimator of the mean to converge to the true mean. So are those things guaranteed or not? If I compute some quantity of interest, the mean or something else, will that quantity be well-posed? Will it inherit the ill-posed nature of the model, or would a small perturbation in the data deliver a significantly different solution? Can we guarantee the convergence of plug-and-play Bayesian algorithms under verifiable conditions? Can we give non-asymptotic accuracy bounds? And then, if these algorithms are really if these models are really very accurate, then maybe the probabilities that we compute will be meaningful from a non-subjective point of view, right? They would be frequentistly valid. So if I repeat the experiment many times and the Bayesian model says probably 10%, then taking an average over many repetitions will be close to 10%. Well, that's not true when we use very simple analytical models, but it could be that plug-and-play models do open, the possibility of having accurate frequentist Bayesian probabilities. Okay, so now we're ready to start talking about Bayesian plug-and-play methods. As I said, this paper is 60 pages long, so I had to decide what to present and what not, what to skip. I will not go into details about proofs, but I will try to give you a flavor of what kind of results we were able to establish. And then I encourage you to consult the paper and get in touch with us by email if you want more details about about any of the mathematical results or about any of the claims that I'm making in the talk. Okay, so first of all, if this, Bayesian algorithms are not really associated with an energy function or anything, that I can easily relate to a Bayesian model, the first question is there a Bayesian model, and will these algorithms compute estimators for that Bayesian model? And the answer is no. Usually there is no underpinning Bayesian model. If you just try to derive the model from the algorithm, it doesn't work. However, what you can do is adopt what is known as an M-complete perspective. So the idea is there exists a true model. I'll call it P star here. The idea is that the unknown image X has a true marginal, mu. When mu admits a density, I call it P star. This is the oracle model. It's decisions theoretically optimal. If you could use it, this is the model you should use. However, we don't know what that model is. We just assume it exists. And anything else that we do will be an approximation of that model. So it's still useful to have this conceptual oracle model because we can first see if that oracle model has what we need to do inference. Is it well posed? Is it well defined? Can it be computed? And then we can then see if the approximations inherit that or not. So I'll call this oracle model P star. There is a prior P star and there is a posterior P star. And we don't know what they are, but we assume they exist. And when we have training data, we'll assume that the training data is a realization or a sample from that prior mu with density P star. Now, I will assume through the talk that the density P star exists. But our results don't really require P star to exist, so we could not have a density. And that's important to provide robustness to situations where P star is either improper or nearly degenerate. Right? So, if you take the manifold hypothesis to the extreme and you really believe that, say, your images live on a lower dimensional manifold, then you can't assume that P star exists, or it would be very nearly degenerate, and that could create lots of problems. So it's important that the results don't rely too much on this. However, for presentation, let's assume it exists. So I have some oracle model P star. Okay, now P star is unknown, so it could not verify any of the conditions that I need for efficient Bayesian computation. It could be not proper, it could be not differentiable, it could be not Lipschitz continuously differentiable, for the log gradient. And if those things are not satisfied, then the plug-and-play algorithms that I described before don't really have any hope of working well, at least not in the way that we understand them. So what we do, the first thing that we do is we're going to regularize this oracle to construct an approximation of the oracle that we can make as close to the oracle as we want, but that by construction has all the properties that we need to do computation. So we'll call this regularized oracle P epsilon star. And P epsilon star comes from taking the prior P star and convolving it with a Gaussian smoothing kernel with bandwidth epsilon. And once you do that, you solve your problems of having a prior that could be not proper or not differentiable. What you get is a posterior P epsilon star of x given y that is smooth and that you can make as close to P star as you want. So we have a proposition on this that says that essentially the regularized densities are proper and smooth, and that epsilon controls the approximation error involved, and that as you let epsilon go to 0, sorry, this is not epsilon infinity, it's epsilon 0, that's a typo, I'll correct it. In point 2, epsilon should be going to 0. So yeah, the error vanishes as epsilon goes to 0. And so this requires basing assumptions on the likelihood. The likelihood P of y given x should be differentiable, and it should not be infinitely large. And there are a few basic assumptions, but they are very basic and standard. And if you have that, then you get that these models P epsilon star really have everything that you need. They have the moments that you need. You can compute the mean. You can compute the variance. And you can really control the difference between, say, the mean of P epsilon star and the mean of P star when P star has a mean. So so yeah, you have very good control of the probabilities with respect to P star and P, and you can also have control of the moments. However, this does not guarantee that we have a log gradient that is Lipschitz continuous, and this is something that we really need for the algorithms. To have this, we need an additional condition. So what we'll do is we'll introduce this oracle denoiser. So we call it d epsilon star. And the idea is, if you take an image, from your true oracle prior mu, and you corrupt it with Gaussian noise, and you train a Bayesian model, or you construct a Bayesian model to recover the original image, and you go for the estimator that is the best one in the universe, in the sense of mean square error, then it is D star. And when you're training a denoiser to denoise images from your training data set, what they are doing is, within the limits of what's possible, they're trying to get close to the epsilon star. So this is a good object to have in our analysis. Now this denoiser is closely related to the gradient we were studying by Tweedy's identity. So Tweedy's identity says that epsilon times the log gradient of P epsilon star of x given y is equal to x minus d epsilon x. Sorry, there's a typo there that I'll correct. It's not x given y, it's just x. So this is the gradient of the prior. But the essential idea is the same. The epsilon star is a gradient. It's the gradient of the log density of the prior after the prior has been smoothed with a Gaussian kernel. And this means that gradient will be Lipschitz when the epsilon star is Lipschitz. Now, when is the epsilon star Lipschitz? Well, essentially when that denoising problem that the epsilon star is trying to solve is well posed. And in the case of this Bayesian estimator, that can be checked. In particular, what we need is the epsilon star to have a mean square error, so an expected mean square error that is finite and that we can bound uniformly. So the idea is, you can take any image in your space of images and generate a corrupted version from that. And then when you recover the original image by using this optimal denoiser, which is trying to minimize the expected mean square error, then that expected mean square error will be finite. So that's a basic requirement to have a Bayesian estimator. And in addition, it will not, it will take values that we can bound. We can put an upper bound on how bad the estimation error is when you have the epsilon star. And we get this in particular when your denoising problem is well posed. So if we have a denoiser that is well posed, at least in the case where you have computed the optimal denoiser, and you do this Gaussian smoothing, you have smoothness of the models, and you have Lipschitz differentiability of the models. And but it still could be that the models are not well posed, so you shouldn't be really calculating anything with these models. Now, this third proposition, what it says is that under very mild assumptions on the likelihood, which are verified, for example, by linear Gaussian observation models, then the posterior distribution P epsilon star is well posed in the sense of Hadamard, so with respect to the total variation metric, but by using inequalities, you can get other forms of well posedness. And that means that when we compute key quantities from this model, they are stable with respect to small perturbations of the data y. Now, having propositions 1, 2, and 3, we can now start talking about constructing algorithms for this kind of models, because these are models for which it is sensible to want to compute things. And they're the kind of models that you can attack by using your gradient algorithms. So we'll first talk about gradient algorithms that use the oracle denoiser, the epsilon star. These are not algorithms you can implement, but they are algorithms that we will be able to study and for which we'll provide guarantees. And then we will show that when you take a generic denoiser, you inherit these guarantees with some bias that comes from the fact that your denoiser is not perfect, but that's okay. We will not make any unrealistic assumptions on the denoiser. The only price you'll pay by using a denoiser that is implementable but not the oracle one, is some bias in your estimation that we can characterize. So, okay, what we do is we now construct a plug-and-play SGD with the denoiser D star. And what proposition 3.4 says is essentially that when you run the stochastic gradient algorithm, if you take any sequence that has not blown up, that's a separate discussion, but if you take any sequence that has not blown up, then that sequence of iterates has been getting closer and closer to a stationary point of the log gradient. So essentially, you are either finding a maxima, a minima, or a saddle point of your posterior distribution, which is really the best you can hope for without having any form of convexity guarantees. But this kind of scheme will converge to a stationary point. So it's the kind of scheme that we would use for maximum a posteriori estimation, particularly if we are initializing carefully, so not too far from a good solution. And yeah, and importantly, from the conditions that we mentioned previously, we know that the maximum a posteriori estimate exists. Otherwise, we could be in a case where it doesn't exist. And under mild conditions on the sequence of step sizes, we have convergence of an oracle ULA. So we would have the same kind of results for the oracle ULA. We would converge to the neighborhood of P epsilon star x given y. So this is an algorithm that if you could use, you should use. Now, there's a detail that I have skipped. A Monte Carlo algorithm, Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm, could converge to the neighborhood of the solution, but not converge sufficiently fast to be useful. So in particular, you want something called geometric ergodicity. So you want it to get there geometrically fast so that it can, well, first of all, be efficient, and secondly, drive a central limit theorem so that your Monte Carlo estimates converge to what you want. I'm simplifying a bit, but that's essentially the idea. Okay, so it could be that your potential function has gradients that vanish as x goes to infinity in some directions, and as a result, you lose geometric ergodicity. Now, to guarantee that you have geometric ergodicity, you need to either train the denoiser in a way that guarantees geometric ergodicity, or you need to enforce it through the scheme. Now, in our case, we're using an oracle denoiser that we don't know. We know it exists, but we don't know its properties. So we can't guarantee geometric ergodicity without enforcing it explicitly. So that's what we do. What we do is we define a set, a very large set in the parameter space that contains most of the mass of x. And then we force gradients to grow when x is outside that set. We can do this in two ways. So either the way in which we do it in PnP ULA, so just by adding x minus the projection of x on this set, or we could do a hard projection on that set. That will introduce more bias typically. In the other case, we're just changing the tails. But these are two ways of ensuring that your scheme is by construction converging geometrically fast. Okay, so now we'll change that denoiser D star, but a denoiser that we can actually implement and use. So we'll call it D epsilon. This is typically a neural network. By construction, it will be Lipschitz continuous, and we will train it to mimic D epsilon star. It will not, however, be a gradient or a prox or anything like that. That's beyond of what we can achieve at the moment, at least in the context of this paper. However, okay, there are other people who are learning proximal operators. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying we didn't do it. And then we will control the Lipschitz constant during training such that it is close to 1 or smaller than 1. And we'll establish that the algorithms that you implement are mimicking those oracle theoretical algorithms, and they inherit their convergence properties modulo some estimation bias that comes from the fact that D epsilon is not D epsilon star. Okay, so the algorithms that we have are these two. They are the same that we had before, just presented as an algorithm. And then there's some conditions on the parameters of the algorithm that we have highlighted there at the top. These are the conditions that you need to check to make sure that our theory holds. So it's a very simple algorithm. At each iteration, you have to evaluate the gradient of your data fidelity term, the neural network which implements the denoiser, and then do or not the projection. In practice, in our experiments, the projection is never activated. X never heads to plus or minus infinity in any direction. So it doesn't activate, but it is there in case it should be required. And we also have the plug and play stochastic gradient descent, which again is the same scheme. The only difference is that the variance of the noise perturbations are a bit different because we're going for a single point in space and not exploring all of the parameter space. And I don't have time to go into detail about this, but essentially the idea is that we can give non-asymptotic guarantees for what is the accuracy of these Monte Carlo methods with very clear terms that come from the fact that we are truncating the parameter space or changing it by introducing a set, the fact that we're doing a finite number of iterations, the fact that your denoiser is not the optimal denoiser. And that's essentially what's happening. And it will converge geometrically fast to the solution that you want with a bias that depends on how you set your algorithm parameters. There's a bias variance trade-off, and that's essentially it. And when you do have an oracle model, P star, that admits the quantity that you want to compute, then we can also give you guarantees directly with respect to P star and not P star epsilon. And for SGD, we have the same thing. You will not converge to the exact maximizer or saddle point, but you will stay in the neighborhood of that maximizer. Okay, I'll conclude my talk with some numerical illustrations. We have considered 3 images and 2 problems: image denoising and image inpainting and image deblurring. The deblurring is with a 9x9 box filter, and the inpainting has a mask of that's hiding 80% of the pixels. We have taken a denoiser that has been previously trained to satisfy these conditions in this paper that I'm highlighting here. And they propose an ADMM algorithm. So we compare against their ADMM algorithm. And we run our, all 3 algorithms, ANULA, SGD, and ADMM on these images. And we obtain solutions that are very good, very competitive in terms of reconstruction quality. This is just an illustration. I'm not claiming that it will always give you the best results that are available in the literature, but both in deblurring and in painting, we obtain very good reconstruction results. A bit better with ULA than with the optimization schemes, possibly because we're computing the posterior mean, possibly because the other algorithms could converge locally. And then what we do, for instance, is to illustrate, do an uncertainty visualization analysis. So we analyze the variance of the solution at different scales. So the idea is if you're looking for the uncertainty in a certain part of the image, and you're looking at a single pixel, then you should look at the standard deviation of the pixel. But if you're looking at the uncertainty of a structure that is bigger, you should go to a scale that involves structures of that size in that part of the image. So what we do is something a bit like a wavelet or a multi-resolution decomposition of the covariance matrix. And we produce these plots. The top one is for deblurring, and the bottom one is for inpainting. And it shows you the uncertainty in different parts of the image. And then to conclude my talk, we took this CT image, and this is a CT image from a data set called Deep Lesion that has annotated CT images. And we added noise and then said, suppose we wanted to know what is the size of the lesion highlighted in the yellow rectangle, but we don't have access to the original image. We have access to a noisy observation. Of course, in practice, you would want to do it directly from the tomographic measurements, but this was just for illustration. And then we said, if you compute, you could do a restoration of this and compute the size of the lesion, but that would ignore the uncertainty. So what we did instead was we computed the posterior probability of the size of the lesion. We did that by running a Markov chain, and then for each state of the Markov chain, doing a segmentation of the lesion and calculating its size. And from that, we got the posterior distribution of the size of the lesion. And what we obtain is an histogram, with different sizes, and that gives you an indication of how confident you are in the size of the lesion based on the data that you have. For instance, if you had to make a decision to determine whether the lesion is shrinking or not following treatment, it's good to have an idea of the uncertainty in that measurement. Okay, so I'll conclude with this. I'll skip the conclusion. It just repeats what I have been saying for the last couple of minutes. And I'll say in terms of perspectives that there's a number of things that are open. We should continue investigating the properties of these models, seeing if we can train D to automatically verify geometric convergence so that we can get rid of the truncating set C. Look at the frequentist validity of this, have misspecification diagnosing so that you don't use this model to analyze data that is too different from what you have used for training your denoiser. Then it's also possible to do something called robust Bayesian inference, where you would target directly the oracle, even though you have an approximation. And then there's ways of accelerating these algorithms. There's much better things than ULA and stochastic gradient descent. So we're hoping to go to that direction and to apply this to problems. So thank you very much. These are the photos of my collaborators and a photo with me of myself when where hairdressers are open. And I'll finish with a cheeky slide. If you like this kind of work and you want to come to work with us in Edinburgh, then send me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Very, very interesting. I learned a lot. So there are already a few questions in the chat. So two of them are very similar. So I just read them to you. So Samuel Hurault, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Abdullah Al-Shabili are asking, why do you force your denoiser to be one Lipschitz?
So I don't,
also in particular,
so in order to have convergence, I need. So essentially, what I need is something that informally looks like having convexity as x goes to infinity. My co-author Valentin and Alain don't like this because convexity at infinity is not a very well-defined notion. But essentially, what I want is my gradients not to vanish as I go to infinity, and I'm compensating this in a number of ways through the regularization that we do. Having an expansive denoiser would be a problem. So we do not want an expansive denoiser. If we had an expansive denoiser, we would have to introduce a more aggressive regularization.
Okay.
In any case, you need control of that Lipschitz constant.
Okay, so I hope this answers the question. Yeah, so there is another question from Jonas Latz. I believe in the experiments you look at posterior means as a point estimate for the images. Did you notice smoothing at the boundaries?
No, we didn't notice smoothing at the boundaries, and that was surprising. If you use a prior that is, say, like a Laplace prior or a TV prior, you will notice smoothing. Here, that was not the case. So very, very mildly. So not nearly as much as I was used to. Let's put it that way.
Okay, and there is another question in the chat. Don't know if you can see it, but I read it to you. So is from Jeffrey Woolard, who is asking, in some types of microscopy, like position emission tomography and electron microscopy, sampling noise is Poissonian. Although a Poisson distribution converges to a Gaussian distribution, Poisson noise in microscopy is signal dependent, so it doesn't converge to white Gaussian noise. So did you consider Poisson noise instead of Gaussian noise? If not, do you expect your approach could be extended to this type of noise, signal dependent noise?
Yeah, so two things. We definitely think it can be extended. The theory supports very clearly that you could tackle non-Gaussian problems, in particular Poisson. You might need to look a bit at what happens near zero. If you have a very low photon regime, you might have some Lipschitz problems there, but you could regularize that in a very specific way called Moro-Yoshida regularization. We have not tested that yet. However, we were recently awarded a very large grant to look at applying this kind of techniques to something called quantum enhanced imaging. So those are imaging problems where you use quantum properties of light to go beyond what you can do with standard imaging. And in those cases, you may have Poisson noise, or much worse, you could have binomial noise or Bernoulli noise. You could have either 1 photon per pixel or no photon in the pixel. And so we are going to be looking at that. And there's actually 2 open postdoc positions on that project and a PhD scholarship. So if anyone likes the sound of that project, get in touch.
Yeah, there is one other question from some Power.
Yeah.
So have you had the chance to look at the priors which are implied by the denoisers? So for instance, if you run your PnP ULA with no likelihood, to say anything about how the samples look?
No, not yet. It's on the to-do list. We have not yet looked at what the Markov chain is doing just from the prior. The problem with that is that so the likelihood contributes a lot to getting the algorithm to work efficiently. So sampling from the prior efficiently in high dimensions is not that easy. We will definitely do it, but it will be a long experiment. So I should probably mention about computing times. So for that paper, if you read the paper, you'll see that we have some absurd computing times, like 60 hours. That's because we're doing 25 million iterations. Because in addition of computing whatever estimates where I'm showing you now, we did lots of convergence diagnosis tests and computed a lot of things that are expensive to compute. And I didn't want to put in the paper anything that I wasn't sure was accurate. However, you will also see in the paper mentions that in something like 2 minutes, you can compute the posterior mean. You just need to do a small number of iterations, 10,000, something like that. And you get something that is identical up to 1% in PSNR or something like that. We have been using very large number of iterations because we were not in a hurry.
Yeah, sure. So maybe there is time for one last question, because I know that then you have to leave. So if anyone has one final question or comment. No? Well, in this case, thank you very much again. It was very, very interesting talk. And just a reminder to the people in the audience that we won't have a seminar next week due to the Easter break, and we start again the week afterwards, so on the 7th of April. Thank you very much again, Marcelo, and to you all for participating.
Okay, thank you very much. And it was a rough talk. I'm sorry, there are a few parts that were a bit too fast. I'll still need to iterate a bit to get it right. I hope it was clear enough. So if you're interested in this and anything wasn't clear, just send me an email. And hopefully, we'll be able to chat in person at some meeting.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcelo. It was really interesting. Great talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.